Mrs. Tiffany had always been fascinated by the supernatural. Growing up, she devoured books about vampires, werewolves, and other mythical creatures. She had an insatiable curiosity and an adventurous spirit that led her on various quests to uncover the truth behind these legends. Recently divorced, Mrs. Tiffany sought solace in the world of fantasy, finding comfort in the idea of love that transcended boundaries. She longed for a romance that would ignite her soul and break free from the constraints of her mundane existence. This quest to date a werewolf and join their clan symbolized her desire for something extraordinary, a connection that would defy societal norms and sweep her off her feet. Little did she know that her journey would be fraught with danger and unexpected twists, testing her courage and determination at every turn. The story begins. Mrs. Tiffany found herself deep in the enchanted forest, surrounded by towering trees and the eerie silence that seemed to permeate the air. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor. She had ventured into this mystical realm in search of the werewolf clan, hoping to catch a glimpse of the captivating creatures that had piqued her interest. As she cautiously treaded over fallen leaves and moss-covered rocks, a rustling sound caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned towards the noise, only to find a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at her. A vampire emerged from the shadows, his fangs glistening in the moonlight. "What would you like to do next?" Mrs. Tiffany decides to call out for help, hoping that someone, or something, might come to her aid. Mrs. Tiffany's heart raced as the vampire approached her, his eyes fixed on her neck. She knew she had to act quickly to survive. "What would you like to do next?" Mrs. Tiffany decides to use her knowledge of vampires to try and negotiate with him. Tiffany took a deep breath, gathering all her knowledge about vampires. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the vampire's piercing gaze. "Wait," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I know you're thirsty, but let's talk. There's no need for violence." The vampire paused, his expression curious. "What could you possibly offer me in exchange for sparing your life?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Tiffany swallowed nervously, her mind racing for a solution. "I can tell you secrets," she replied, her voice gaining confidence. "Secrets about the werewolves, their weaknesses, and their hidden territories. I can give you an advantage over them." The vampire's interest was piqued. He leaned in closer, his fangs glinting in the moonlight. "You expect me to believe you have such valuable information?" he sneered. Tiffany reached into her bag and pulled out a worn journal, filled with notes about the supernatural creatures she had studied for years. She handed it to the vampire, her hands trembling slightly. "I've dedicated my life to the study of the supernatural," she said, her voice tinged with sincerity. "This journal contains everything I know about the werewolves. It's yours if you spare me." The vampire studied the journal intently, flipping through the pages. After a long moment, he looked up at Tiffany, a wicked smile playing on his lips. "Very well," he conceded. "Consider yourself lucky, for tonight, your life is spared. What would you like to do next?" Mrs. Tiffany decides to use her knowledge to manipulate the vampire into becoming allies with the werewolves. The vampire raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the proposal. "You think I would betray my own kind for the sake of werewolves?" he scoffed. Tiffany maintained her composure, her eyes unwavering. "Think about it," she said persuasively. "If you join forces with the werewolves, you could become an unstoppable force. Together, you could rule this world." The vampire considered her words, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "And what would be in it for me?" he questioned. Tiffany smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Power, eternal companionship, and the chance to unite two powerful supernatural races. Imagine the legacy you could leave behind." The vampire's lips curled into a sinister grin. "Very well," he said, extending his hand towards Tiffany. "We have a deal. But remember, if this is a trick, I won't hesitate to end you." Tiffany nodded, shaking the vampire's hand firmly. "I understand," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "But I promise you, this is the beginning of something extraordinary. What would you like to do next?" Mrs. Tiffany convinces the vampire to meet with the werewolf pack leader. Mrs. Tiffany convinces the vampire to meet with the werewolf pack leader. As the vampire and Mrs. Tiffany made their way through the enchanted forest, they could sense the presence of the werewolf pack nearby. The air was heavy with anticipation, and Mrs. Tiffany's heart raced with excitement. They arrived at a clearing where the werewolf pack leader, a majestic and powerful creature, awaited their arrival. The pack leader's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the vampire, his instincts on high alert. Mrs. Tiffany stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Great pack leader, I bring before you a proposition that could change the course of our supernatural world. This vampire has agreed to join forces with us, to unite our races for a common goal." The pack leader's gaze shifted between Mrs. Tiffany and the vampire, his expression unreadable. "And why should we trust a vampire?" he growled, his voice laced with skepticism. Mrs. Tiffany took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Because, great leader, he understands the power and potential that lies within the alliance of our races. With our combined strength, we can protect our kind from the threats that loom in the shadows." The pack leader's eyes flickered with intrigue, and Mrs. Tiffany knew she had piqued his interest. "Prove your loyalty, vampire," the pack leader demanded. "Show us that you are willing to fight alongside us. What would you like to do next?" Mrs. Tiffany decides to. The vampire undergoes a ritual to demonstrate his commitment to the werewolf pack. The vampire undergoes a ritual to demonstrate his commitment to the werewolf pack. The pack leader leads them to a sacred clearing where a fire burns brightly in the center. The vampire stands before the pack, his eyes locked with the pack leader's. The pack leader raises his hand and slashes his own palm, letting the blood drip into a silver chalice. He offers the chalice to the vampire, who takes it and drinks the blood, sealing his alliance with the werewolf pack. The pack erupts into a chorus of howls, accepting the vampire as one of their own. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany suggests a ceremony to officially induct the vampire into the werewolf clan. Mrs. Tiffany suggests a ceremony to officially induct the vampire into the werewolf clan. The pack leader considers her proposal and nods in agreement. He orders the pack to prepare for the ceremony and calls upon the elders to gather in the sacred clearing. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany takes part in a traditional werewolf dance to honor the alliance. Mrs. Tiffany takes part in a traditional werewolf dance to honor the alliance. The pack leader joins her in the dance, showcasing their unity and acceptance of the vampire into their clan. The dance is filled with energy and excitement as the werewolves howl at the moon, their movements synchronized and powerful. Mrs. Tiffany feels a surge of adrenaline as she dances alongside the pack, feeling a sense of belonging and connection. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany notices a mysterious figure watching the dance from the shadows. Mrs. Tiffany notices a mysterious figure watching the dance from the shadows. As the figure steps forward, it becomes clear that it is a werewolf from a rival pack. The tension in the air escalates as the werewolf snarls, challenging the alliance and questioning the vampire's loyalty. The pack leader steps forward, ready to defend their newfound ally. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany attempts to communicate telepathically with the rival werewolf to understand their concerns. Mrs. Tiffany focuses her thoughts, attempting to establish a telepathic connection with the rival werewolf. She reaches out with her mind, hoping to understand their concerns and bridge the gap between the two packs. As Mrs. Tiffany concentrates, she feels a sudden surge of energy. The rival werewolf's eyes widen in surprise, sensing the intrusion. A brief moment of connection forms between their minds, allowing Mrs. Tiffany to glimpse the werewolf's doubts and fears about the alliance. Before she can delve deeper into the telepathic conversation, the rival werewolf forcefully breaks the connection, growling in defiance. The tension in the air thickens, and a low rumble of disapproval spreads among the werewolves. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany uses her knowledge of werewolf customs to show respect to the rival pack. Mrs. Tiffany approaches the rival pack leader with a solemn expression, bowing her head in a show of respect. She addresses the werewolf in a calm and steady voice, acknowledging their doubts and fears. She explains how the alliance would benefit both packs, emphasizing the strength they would gain by standing together against common enemies. Mrs. Tiffany also assures the rival pack leader that their traditions and customs will be respected, and that this alliance is not meant to diminish their pack's independence or individuality. She offers her assistance in addressing any concerns they may have and suggests a meeting between the two pack leaders to further discuss the alliance. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany suggests a formal ceremony to solidify the alliance, symbolizing the unity and shared goals of both packs. Mrs. Tiffany suggests a formal ceremony to solidify the alliance, symbolizing the unity and shared goals of both packs. The rival pack leader listens intently, considering her proposal. After a moment of silence, the rival pack leader nods in agreement, acknowledging the importance of the alliance. They express their willingness to participate in the ceremony and discuss further details with Mrs. Tiffany. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany reaches out to other supernatural beings for their involvement in the ceremony. Mrs. Tiffany reaches out to other supernatural beings for their involvement in the ceremony. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany approaches a group of shapeshifters to provide entertainment during the ceremony. Mrs. Tiffany approaches a group of shapeshifters to provide entertainment during the ceremony. The shapeshifters, initially wary of Mrs. Tiffany's presence, observe her with caution. She explains her purpose and the significance of their involvement in the ceremony. Intrigued, the shapeshifters agree to participate and showcase their unique abilities. They transform into various animals, mesmerizing the crowd with their agility and grace. The atmosphere becomes filled with awe and excitement as the shapeshifters captivate everyone with their performance. Mrs. Tiffany watches with delight, knowing that their contribution will make the ceremony even more memorable. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany seeks out a group of witches to add a magical element to the ceremony. Mrs. Tiffany seeks out a group of witches to add a magical element to the ceremony. She approaches the witches, who are gathered around a cauldron, casting spells and chanting incantations. They initially eye her suspiciously, but she quickly explains her purpose and the importance of their participation in the ceremony. Intrigued by the opportunity to showcase their magical abilities, the witches agree to join in. They start conjuring enchanting lights and illusions, creating a mystical atmosphere that adds a touch of magic to the event. The crowd is mesmerized by the witches' display, and Mrs. Tiffany watches with satisfaction as the ceremony becomes even more captivating. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany decides to approach the pack leader and ask for his opinion on the ceremony. Mrs. Tiffany approaches the pack leader, a strong and imposing werewolf with a wise gaze. She respectfully addresses him, explaining her purpose and asking for his opinion on the ceremony. The pack leader listens attentively, his expression thoughtful. After a moment of silence, he nods approvingly, acknowledging the effort Mrs. Tiffany has put into organizing the event. He commends her for her dedication to the alliance and assures her that the ceremony will strengthen the bond between the vampires and werewolves. Satisfied with his response, Mrs. Tiffany thanks him and returns to oversee the proceedings. What would you like to do next? Mrs. Tiffany decides to have a private conversation with the vampire ally and discuss their future plans. Mrs. Tiffany finds a secluded spot away from the ceremony and approaches the vampire ally. They sit down together, their expressions serious yet hopeful. Mrs. Tiffany begins the conversation by expressing her gratitude for the vampire's help in arranging the ceremony. The vampire nods, appreciating the recognition. They then discuss their future plans and the possibilities that lie ahead. Mrs. Tiffany shares her desire to not only strengthen the alliance between vampires and werewolves but also to explore her own feelings towards werewolves. The vampire listens attentively, understanding Mrs. Tiffany's aspirations. They both agree to support each other's goals and work together towards a harmonious coexistence between their kind. What would you like to do next? Thank you for playing. A harmonious coexistence. As the sun begins to set over the enchanted forest, casting a golden glow upon the clearing where the werewolf ceremony took place, Mrs. Tiffany stands at the center of the gathering. The werewolf pack leader, the vampire ally, the group of shapeshifters, and the coven of witches all surround her, their eyes filled with anticipation and pride. Mrs. Tiffany takes a deep breath, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. She looks around at the faces of those who have become her allies, her friends, and her family throughout this incredible journey. Her gaze meets the pack leaders, who smiles warmly at her, acknowledging the bond they have formed. With a clear and steady voice, Mrs. Tiffany begins to retell the tale of her adventure. She recounts how she sought solace in the fantasy world after her divorce, how she ventured into the enchanted forest in search of supernatural beings, and how she encountered the vampire who could have ended her life. But instead, she used her knowledge and negotiation skills to forge an alliance that would change everything. She continues, describing the moments of uncertainty and doubt, the challenges they faced, and the friendships they formed along the way. She speaks of the shapeshifters who brought joy and entertainment to the ceremony, their performances captivating and enchanting. She speaks of the witches, who added a touch of magic to the proceedings, their spells and potions infusing the air with wonder and fascination. As Mrs. Tiffany reaches the end of her story, her voice carries the triumph and hope that now fills her heart. She expresses her gratitude to each and every person and creature who played a part in this extraordinary tale, including her loyal pet cat, Midnight, who has been her constant companion throughout. The crowd erupts into applause, their cheers and laughter echoing through the forest. Mrs. Tiffany turns to the vampire ally, their eyes meeting once again. With a smile, she takes the vampire's hand, intertwining their fingers as a symbol of their united front. Together, they look out at the werewolf pack, the shapeshifters, and the witches, and they see not just allies, but a new family. They see a future where vampires and werewolves coexist in harmony, where misunderstandings are replaced by understanding, and where love transcends boundaries. As the scene fades, Mrs. Tiffany and her vampire ally walk hand in hand, their steps light and purposeful. They know that their journey is far from over, but they face the future with hope, determination, and a love that bridges the gap between their worlds. And so, their story continues, forever entwined in the tapestry of a fantastical world, where love knows no boundaries and where the impossible becomes possible. What would you like to do next?